Well, hello. It's wonderful to have you here with us. My name is Dr. Ruth Mitchell. I'm a neurosurgeon here in Sydney, in Australia, and I'm the chair of the board of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. It's my honor to chair this important briefing here today, and I'm grateful that you've decided to spend time with us. I'm overjoyed that this has had such a broad reach, but I'm devastated that it's necessary for us to be having a conversation about the war in Ukraine and about the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe. So we've come together to bring you three experts on these issues and to try and grapple with where we're up to 1 year into a violent conflict, an invasion in Ukraine that has put us all at risk and has us all on a level of alert that we probably haven't been for some time. So we're going to go through three wonderful experts who are going to brief us. The format is that we'll have 3 10-minute talks. And during those talks, if you find yourself having comments or questions, I really invite you to drop those into the chat straight away. And then what we'll do is at the end of the third talk, we'll take those questions together and we'll be able to have a discussion about what's been presented. So our three speakers today are Dr. Barry Levy, who is an associate professor an adjunct professor of public health at Tufts University, and Linda Pence-Gunter, who's the international specialist at Beyond Nuclear, and finally, Dr. Ira Helfand, who's immediate past president of IPPNW and also on the board of IPPNW with me. So we're really delighted that we have this group of people here to share with you. And I hope you're looking forward to learning from them, as I certainly am. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Barry Levy.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ruth. To start, I'd like you to close your eyes and recall some of the images of the war. A school destroyed by a missile, mothers and children fleeing across the border to Poland, shelling of a nuclear power plant, a pregnant woman carried from a maternity hospital that had been bombed, a row of men in Bucha being led to their execution, and dozens of people killed at a train station in eastern Ukraine. You can open your eyes now. The extent of the war's impact on Ukrainian civilians has been much, much greater than what we recall in these images. Today, I will present a brief overview of the consequences of the war on health, human rights, and the environment. First, a few words about the context of the war. Armed conflict in Ukraine began not a year ago, but actually in 2014, with armed conflict begun by so-called Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine is a huge country, as large as Texas. Its pre-war population was the same as California, about 44 million. And the impacts of the war vary by area. Most of the fighting has been in the eastern and southeastern portions of the country, but attacks on civilians with bombs, shells, missiles, and drones have occurred throughout most of the country. On this map, you can see Kiev. You can see Kiev in the middle, Lviv in the west, Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk on the east, and going counterclockwise, bordering countries, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. Compared with other recent wars, this war is similar, with many attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, but in some ways it's very different. Most recent wars have been not interstate wars like this one, but rather intrastate conflicts in low-income countries. And most wars have been in distant places, which most Americans cannot find on a map. But this war, of course, is in the center of Europe, with intense coverage in the news media and by social media, including many people equipped with cell phones who are not only reporting on the war, but documenting presumptive war crimes. The numbers of civilian deaths and injuries are likely very large. However, the UN reported less than 2 weeks ago only about 7,000 deaths and 11,000 injuries among Ukrainian civilians. These numbers are gross underestimates of the actual numbers. To just give one example, about 8 months ago, the mayor of Mariupol estimated that just in Mariupol alone, there had been more than 20,000 deaths of civilians. And these do not include fatal and non-fatal illnesses that have occurred as a result of the war. There are many challenges, as shown on this slide, to obtaining accurate data on morbidity and mortality, breakdowns in surveillance and data systems, displacement of populations, distant impacts, delayed impacts that may occur even years later, incentives on both sides to overreport or underreport, and the fog of war. What does get reported are primarily deaths and injuries due to bombings, shellings, and missile and drone attacks, some of which have been indiscriminate attacks, but many of which have been targeted at civilian neighborhoods and civilian infrastructure. An apartment house in Kyiv and a shopping center and an adjacent roadway also in Kyiv that was attacked last March. Less frequently, the news media report on the indirect morbidity and mortality among civilians, although the occurrence of these disorders is likely far greater than the occurrence of disease and injuries from explosive weapons. They get reported much less frequently. 4 months ago, the world, and most prominently among these are mental and behavioral disorders. 4 months ago, the World Health Organization stated that almost 10 million Ukrainians, there may indeed be more, are at risk of developing mental health conditions, PTSD, anxiety and depression, alcoholism and drug abuse, and suicide. A few words about communicable diseases. Prominent have been gastrointestinal diseases, likely due to damage to water treatment and supply, and foodborne diseases because of inadequate refrigeration. We don't have exact numbers. We don't even have approximate numbers on the numbers of GI diseases and respiratory diseases like these listed that have increased because of airborne transmission in crowded areas such as subway stations where people have sheltered. Suffering from non-communicable diseases is also likely increased, both due to new onset of heart attacks, strokes, and other diseases, and also probably largely due to exacerbations of pre-existing diseases like the one shown here. A survey by the World Health Organization just a few months ago found that half of the people surveyed experienced at least one barrier to accessing medical care, most commonly cost, and almost 1/4 could not get the medications they needed because of cost availability and long waiting lines. As expected, access to care and medications was lowest in areas where there had been active fighting or occupation by Russian forces. The health of civilians has been worsened by attacks on infrastructure. Almost 500 health facilities have been damaged since the start of the violence in late 2015, with many health workers killed, kidnapped, and injured, and these numbers are certainly underestimates of the actual numbers. This is a destroyed city hospital in Kharkiv. Numerous targeted attacks on the energy infrastructure have resulted in loss of electricity and heat for millions of Ukrainians and result in adverse effects on health and availability of health care. And targeted destruction of farms and the food supply system and damage to roads and railroads have also adversely affected health. And then there have been a huge number of casualties among Ukrainian and Russian military personnel, which are estimated to be 100,000 on each side, but indeed could be much larger. Keep in mind that prior to the war, the vast majority of both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers were civilians, and that once the war began, most had little choice but to take up arms, including thousands of Russian prisoners who were freed from jail on the condition that they be sent to the front lines, generally with little training and no adequate equipment. And of course, many of them have died. The health of civilians has been worsened by forced displacement. This slide showed the number of refugees registered for national protection in other countries. A total about 5 million, about half in adjacent countries, and the others in Western Europe. Here's a child on a train in Lviv heading for Poland, and a Ukrainian family fleeing across the Hungarian border. About up to 8 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced. In fact, many of them have been displaced multiple times. And there are many others who know that they could be displaced at a moment's notice. Their plight is often far worse than those who have crossed international borders. But both refugees and internally displaced persons have faced risks to their physical and mental health, including threats to their safety and security, especially women and adolescent girls. The health of civilians has also been placed at increased risk because of impacts of the war on the environment, from explosions and fires, which have polluted air, water, and soil with toxic chemicals and other hazardous substances, as shown here. Widespread deployment of anti-personnel landmines, which people estimate have covered more than a quarter of the land area of the country. and the presence of unexploded ordnance. And both the landmines and the unexploded ordnance pose long-term safety risks and also prohibit people from living there or using the land for agricultural uses. Extensive military use of fossil fuels has generated greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And as you will hear shortly from Linda, the war has markedly increased risks of population exposure to ionizing radiation and radioactive materials. The war has destroyed the built environment, homes, offices, factories, schools, and it has caused damage to ecosystems and animal habitats. During the course of the war, there have been tens of thousands of reports of presumptive war crimes, attacks on hospitals and schools. Here's a school destroyed by a bomb last March. Russian deployment of landmines and cluster munitions, like this powerful so-called POM-2 landmine, which explodes when it senses nearby footsteps. And this rocket loaded with dozens of cluster munitions in violation of international humanitarian law. Other presumptive war crimes have included targeted assassination, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, deprivation of food, water, and shelter, and forced deportation. Forced deportation, or also known as forced transfer of civilians, is prohibited under international humanitarian law and can be prosecuted as a war crime and a crime against humanity. In the first 5 months of the war, there were an estimated 900,000 to 1.6 million Ukrainians who were forcibly deported to Russia, including over 250,000 children. And just in the last week or so, there have been reports of 43 camps in Russia where forcibly deported children are being held. The adverse effects of the war go far beyond Ukraine. Ukraine supplies food for about 400 million people globally and accounts for a significant share of global production of wheat, barley, maize, and other grains. Of great concern has been the reduction in food production and export due to a decrease in farm yields, interruptions in food transport, intermittent blockade of grain export by Russian ships. And despite the Russia-Ukraine grain agreement, all this has contributed to food shortages in other countries, including Yemen, which is experiencing its own civil war, and higher food prices globally. When IPPNW presented a webinar last February, 5 days before the war began, many people doubted that Russia would actually invade, and few people predicted that if the war did occur, it would last more than a few months. But here we are almost a year later with the war intensifying and no end in sight. From a public health perspective, current challenges include protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure, providing medical care and humanitarian assistance, providing safe means of exit for those people who want to leave their homes, and the threat of nuclear weapons being used, as Ira will discuss in a few moments. And there will be additional challenges after the war ends, including, and not necessarily limited to these, reintegrating displaced people, creating a framework for reparations, repairing and rebuilding infrastructure, and indeed much of the country, providing for the many people affected by mental and physical disorders, holding aggressors accountable, and building sustainable peace. Health and social service professionals can help address all of these challenges. As I contemplate the catastrophic impacts of this war, I am reminded of the late British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, who once said, "War does not determine who is right, only who is left."
Thank you so much, Dr. Levy, for that sobering presentation. Really brings home what is happening on the ground in Ukraine, the current and future ramifications of this conflict. So with that in mind, we will now turn to Linda Pence-Gunter from the organization Beyond Nuclear. Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Ruth. I'll just get my slides up here. Okay. Everybody can see these, I think. So as Barry mentioned, we had a webinar a year ago in which we warned of all the possible catastrophes that could occur, particularly because there are 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine. And sure enough, the war ensued. And many of the things that we flagged then have indeed happened. The first thing that could contribute to a major release of radioactivity would be loss of off-site power. That's loss of the grid. And then on-site power. These plants depend on diesel backup generators to continue the cooling process. And indeed, we have seen loss of off-site power at, I think, now all 4 of the nuclear power plant sites that are active, as well as the closed Chernobyl site. We have not yet seen loss of on-site power. So far, they have deployed the diesel generators and they have worked, but of course, they require refueling as well. And if there's a serious conflict going on around the plant and you can't access it, you wouldn't be able to deliver backup diesel fuel. We also last year flagged the possibility of human error when you have workers working at a nuclear power plant in war conditions. And indeed, we've seen that already, particularly at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant site, which is the 6th reactor site, which is embroiled directly in the conflict in an area of the country that has been illegally annexed now by Russia. And there we've heard stories of workforces working under duress, even gunpoint, possibly subject to violence. Some of them have fled and not returned, which means the workforce is considerably depleted. And so when you're working under those sorts of conditions, human error, which was, of course, the cause at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, is made more probable. And the third thing that we flagged was either an accidental or deliberate military strike. It seems hard to understand why either side would benefit from deliberately striking a nuclear power plant, although, of course, they have both accused each other of doing precisely that. But an accidental strike is, of course, imminently possible given we're in the chaos of war. And that would be if it was a major bombardment, a bombing or shelling that actually breached the reactors and the fuel pools. That would be the worst case scenario when you would see a major release of radioactivity. And I'm not able to advance my slides for some reason, sorry. Are you able to move them, Molly? I'm sorry, I can't seem to move it. Let's see. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, got it. So why worry? Where if we listen to the propaganda about nuclear power plants, we're told that they are quite safe and there's nothing to worry about. But of course, that is contradicted by the reality of the extreme level of anxiety that we now have about these 4 nuclear power plants in Ukraine, in these 4 different sites. And you can see Zaporizhia there in the eastern part of the country, which is the most embroiled in the war and actually is the biggest nuclear power plant, not only in Ukraine, but also in the whole of Europe. Nuclear power is inherently dangerous. So a war just makes the kinds of risks I'm talking about, a major release of radioactivity, more likely. I mean, you just have to think about the possibility of Ukraine running only on solar and wind power, and I wouldn't be here today and there would be nothing to talk about. So clearly the nuclear power plants are the risk. I'm focusing on Zaporizhia today because it is the biggest one. Like any nuclear power plant, it has about 200 radioactive isotopes that could be released at any given moment if there were a major catastrophe there. But at Zaporizhia, there are also 2,000 tons plus of nuclear waste on site, 855 of those tons in the fuel pools, which is the most radioactive of the waste. And the reason there's so much waste there is because these reactors have been operating for a very long time. The first of the 6 came online in 1985 and the 6 in 1996. Some of the isotopes that could get out are iodine-131, a gas that attacks the thyroid, cesium-137, which accumulates in muscle, strontium-90, which acts like calcium and incorporates into bone, and of course, plutonium-239, which has a half-life of 24,000 years, and when inhaled, attacks lungs, kidneys, and so forth. So how far would this radioactivity spread if something drastic were to happen today in Ukraine? Well, we have a little bit of a guide from the Chernobyl fallout map, which is what we're looking at here. And of course, where that fallout goes depends on the wind speed and direction and where it rains. And you can see from that map that the hotspots are quite inconsistent. It's not necessarily the hottest where the disaster happened, getting less dangerous the further you go. So you can see hotspots in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, also Austria, which got very badly hit, its neighbors not so much. So it's a little bit random. And what we have to remember is that this is the Chernobyl fallout map, Chernobyl was only 2 years old when it exploded, and yet it released 200 times more radiation than Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs combined. And that's a 2-year-old reactor with a much smaller waste inventory. So Zaporizhzhia, with 6 reactors and far more waste, if it was completely breached, would dwarf the Chernobyl disaster. Even still, the Chernobyl disaster has left an exclusion zone that is 1,000 square miles, and it contaminated 40% of the European landmass with radioactivity outside of the original Soviet countries. How long would this last? Well, I think this is one of the most important reasons why we should elevate the concerns about a nuclear power plant disaster at least close to, if not equivalent to, the concerns we have about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And the reason is that these isotopes persist in the environment and in our bodies for a very, very long time. It's not just a question of people who were exposed at the time of the disaster through inhalation or ingestion. Because of the fallout through precipitation, this gets into the food chain. And so you've got radioactive contamination of soil, crops, livestock, animals, water supply, and so forth. Even today, there are wild boar and mushrooms in Germany that are still too radioactive to eat from the Chernobyl disaster. Reindeer in Lapland, the same thing. Sheep in certain parts of the UK could not come back to market until 2012. And it's important also to remember that people live in Hiroshima today. That is not, of course, in any way to diminish the horrors of what happened there. But Chernobyl zone, nobody should be living in, and nobody will be living in for a very, very long time. So the medical consequences persist for generations. Some of the harms to human health that can result from exposure to a nuclear power plant accident include thyroid cancer and birth defects, which are still increasing amongst populations living in exposed areas, stillbirths, neonatal deaths, leukemias, especially amongst children, although I should point out that childhood leukemia has been found in elevated rates amongst children living just close to regularly operating reactors without even a disaster happening. Cardiovascular disorders, this picture you're looking at is a child born with Chernobyl heart, which is a phenomenon found after the Chernobyl disaster of multiple heart defects at birth, and other things such as cataracts, radiation-induced organic mental disorders, and so forth. So what can be done? Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency's response, and this is their sort of superhero photo with Rafael Grossi, their chief, in the center of the picture, have called for safe zones around Ukraine's nuclear power plants, particularly Zaporizhzhia. But so far, they have not succeeded in establishing these, and in fact have been trying to shift change the watchdogs and observers from the IAEA that are there now, and have not been able to do that for the last week and a half because the fighting around Zaporizhzhia is too intense. And of course, the IAEA has a major conflict of interest, which is that it's in place to promote the use of nuclear power around the world. So they came out, it's Rafael Grossi's quote, it's very simple. The problem in Ukraine and in Russia is they're at war. The problem is not nuclear energy, which is, of course, contradicted completely by the other things he says about the fact that they're playing with fire and things are out of control and you cannot have war around a nuclear power plant. Why not? Because it's inherently dangerous and will release radioactivity if attacked and breached. Unfortunately, the response in Ukraine has not been what we would hope it would be to this ever-present danger of 15 reactors potentially under assault in the country. And they just recently did, the Energy Department in Ukraine just recently did a deal with the US to buy a Westinghouse AP1000 reactors. And they would be sited at Melnitskyi, where its 2 existing reactors have more than once now had to be shut down because of Russian missile attacks close by. So this is a deeply illogical response, and the only explanation that I've seen that makes any sense at all was the quote at the bottom where they said, you know, we want no more old Soviet technology. So I think this is part of the sort of divorce process from Russia to say, well, we're not going to use your reactors anymore, but we'll use deeply flawed American reactors. And that's a whole nother presentation about what's gone on with Westinghouse. So in conclusion, nuclear power plants are a liability in war because of the devastation they could wreak if they were attacked and breached. but they also have to be shut down if they're in the middle of war zone as a safety precaution. And this delivers another level of suffering to the people of Ukraine, because Ukraine relies for 50% of its electricity from its nuclear power plants. We're in winter now. Barry described the conditions there amongst people. They're in the cold, they can't get food, and 50% of their electricity is not going to be available if you have to shut these plants down. The IAEA safe zone is a necessary step, but it only prevents the worst scenario, which is an attack on the nuclear power plant itself. Loss of power from attacks on the grid, human error could all still lead to the same catastrophe and will not be prevented by safe zones. And nuclear power plants, of course, are never safe. So war just increases the risks. And the price of failure, in the view of my organization, Beyond Nuclear, is just too high to justify their continued use. This is a quick slide just to give you my contact information and our organizational websites if you want to follow up with us later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for that really thorough and really worrying briefing on the state of affairs with nuclear power in Ukraine. It's a real challenge when you think about this sort of duplicity and naivety from the IAEA, and I thank you for bringing such clarity to such a detailed and complex matter. And I just wanted to remind everyone that as you have comments and questions, please drop those into the comments box for us so that we can take them all together at the end. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Ira Helfen from IPPNW to take us through the final of our 3 briefings. Thank you, Ira.
Thanks, Ruth. And just bring up my slides if I could do that. Are my slides showing on screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So, you know, as Barry mentioned in his presentation, just a year ago this weekend, we met to discuss what might happen if there was a war in Ukraine. And one of the concerns was that a conventional war there might escalate to a nuclear war. I think we recognize this was a possibility, but even with that advanced understanding, we were shocked by the degree to which nuclear weapons use has been threatened in the course of this war. Right at the outset, just a few days after the invasion on February 24th, President Putin declared his first step was to put Russian nuclear forces on what he called a special mode of combat duty. And a few days later, he issued an explicit threat that Russia will respond immediately and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history if countries came to the aid of Ukraine. This was echoed a few months later on April 24th by Foreign Minister Lavrov, who said that support for Ukraine would lead to World War III. In September, Lavrov went on to say that he would not rule out the use of nuclear weapons to defend the 4 provinces of Ukraine, which Russia had just illegally annexed. And a few days later, a former Russian president, Medvedev, warned of a nuclear apocalypse if NATO came to the aid of Ukraine. In January, Medvedev said that Russian defeat might trigger a nuclear war. And the same day, the Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, said that the destruction of Russia will mean the end of the world. These are just a few of the quotes that have come from the official leadership in Russia, in which they have threatened the use of nuclear weapons in the course of this conflict. Some even more hyperbolic threats have come from commentators on Russian-sanctioned media. The head of RT, Russia Today, Simonyan, she specifically called for nuclear confrontation with the West, saying no one will win in a nuclear war, but who needs the world if Russia isn't in it? It was voiced out loud. It was said by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin himself. So the concern that nuclear weapons might be used is clearly not just theoretical. There have been explicit and repeated threats, mainly from the Russian Federation, to use nuclear weapons in this conflict. And this has led to a lot of discussion about what that would look like, and focusing on the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. So let's talk about tactical nuclear weapons for a minute. the definition of a tactical nuclear weapon is not necessarily related to its size. It's related to the intent of the weapon. Tactical weapons are designed to be used on the battlefield. Strategic weapons are designed to be used to attack the cities in an opponent's home territory. But these tactical nuclear weapons, although they are generally smaller than the largest of strategic weapons, are not necessarily small. The yields range anywhere from 0.3 of a kiloton up to 170 kilotons, which is 10 times bigger than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And so we should not be lulled into any complacency that these would necessarily be small weapons that would be used. Our concern about the possible use of tactical weapons, a possible limited, if you will, nuclear war in Ukraine, I think has been underlined by the release in August of this past year of an important new study by Lily Shah and her colleagues looking at what would happen with a limited nuclear war. And her study considered a number of different scenarios, ranging from the use of 100 nuclear weapons to 250 bombs, and these weapons ranging in size from 50 kilotons, the size of the Hiroshima bomb, to 100 kilotons, about 6 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb. What the study showed was that the death toll overall would be anywhere from 25 to 125 million people killed promptly, vast radioactive contamination over a large area, and global climate disruption from the soot from the fires these explosions would cause that would have catastrophic effects throughout the globe. This slide summarizes the findings for each of 5 scenarios that were considered in this paper, ranging from the use of 100 weapons of 15 kilotons each. This was a scenario that was first discussed more than a decade ago, and the current study showed that, in fact, this kind of a war could kill up to 260 million people worldwide due to the climate disruption and subsequent famine. The modeling here was done in assuming a war between India and Pakistan and South Asia, but the study makes clear that these global effects are not dependent on the location of the war. Any equivalent war using the same numbers of weapons, targeting cities with the same amount of combustible material, would produce similar results. The 100 warhead scenario was first published in 2006. But since then, arsenals have grown substantially. And so in this current study, scenarios were considered in which 250 weapons were used. And again, if they're relatively small, Hiroshima-sized bombs, the direct fatalities are 52 million people dead. The global fatalities due to climate disruption are 930 million. If 100 kiloton weapons were used, the direct fatalities would be 127 million people. The global fatalities, 2.1 billion. These scenarios were considered because they are within the range of current Indian and Pakistani arsenals. The study also looked at what might happen in the near future when those arsenals grow to a total of 500 weapons, and concluded that if these were 100 kiloton weapons each, 2.5 billion people worldwide would die. Of course, it is not just a limited nuclear war that we need to be concerned about. There is every reason to fear that if any nuclear weapons are used in the war in Ukraine, that this might escalate to a large-scale war between the United States and NATO on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand. And the study looked at that as well, and found that a large-scale war between NATO and Russia would kill up to 3/4 of the human population, at current numbers over 6 billion people. Clearly, this is an extraordinary danger. And I think part of the reason that we are so frightened by this is that we feel that we have little control over what's going on, little ability to affect the course of events. And if we are to be honest, I think that is true. We do have little ability to affect what's going on. Whether this conflict turns into a nuclear war will be determined primarily by decisions made by one individual who has not shown particularly good judgment over the last year. And so if we get past this current crisis, I think we're going to have to acknowledge that, as has been the case so often in the past, we will survive largely because we are lucky. But if there's little that we can do about the immediate crisis, there's a great deal that we can do if we are lucky enough to survive this crisis to make sure we are not in the situation again. What I've been talking about is the future that will be if we do not act, but it is not the future that must be. There's a lot that we can do to try to eliminate nuclear weapons and make sure that we never again face this kind of grave peril. In July of 2017, the United Nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The vote was 122 to 1. In January of 2021, following the 50th ratification, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force, and it is now legally binding on the 68 countries which have currently ratified the treaty. The work that we must now really address is getting the countries which have these weapons to also enter into the treaty process, because so far none of them have done that. And for example, here in the United States, we've launched something called the Back from the Brink campaign, which is working to bring the United States to lead negotiations among all 9 nuclear-armed countries for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate all remaining nuclear weapons in the world. This is not an unrealistic goal. It's an ambitious goal, but it's not unrealistic. Those of us who advocate for the elimination of nuclear weapons are told that we are living in a fantasy land, that it can never happen. In fact, after each of the great crises in the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Euro Missile Crisis of 1983, there was a rebound effect. The leaders of countries which had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war frightened themselves. And they had a moment where they understood what they were doing and how incredibly irrational it was. And they were open to a new approach. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union signed and ratified in short order the treaty banning atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and they set up the hotline. Following the Euro Missile Crisis in 1983, within 2 years, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed that nuclear war could never be fought and could never be won and must never be fought, and began the process of ending the Cold War arms race. And so I think there is great reason to hope that if we all do our part, we can have the same kind of result from this terrible disaster that is ongoing in Ukraine today. And that this can lead to a moment when the leaders of the world understand the urgent need to eliminate these weapons. This is what's at stake, as we all know. 8 billion people on the planet. Billions of young children who have not had a chance to live the lives which they are entitled to. It is up to us to take action. The message of the physicians movement has always been that if there's no cure, there must be all efforts directed at prevention. And we ask people to trust us because we're doctors. I think this is a message which belongs not just to the physicians movement, but to the entire world. We are facing a critical moment. We're facing a fork in the road. We can either go down the path that we are currently on, which is leading to nuclear war, or we can begin the process of eliminating these weapons once and for all. And that's what we need to do. Again, this is a slide that just shows the web addresses of some of the key organizations that we were involved with. Physicians for Social Responsibility in the United States, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and the Back from the Brink campaign here in the United States. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ira, for that really helpful presentation, taking us through the state of the world when it comes to the threat from nuclear weapons and the ill-advised comments that have been made and which have been escalating, as you so clearly mapped out for us. Now we've had a number of questions come in. First of all, I just want to thank all 3 speakers for your excellent presentations. It's been a really very thorough briefing, and it really allows us to hold a really balanced perspective on where we are at the moment and where to go from here, which is what we'll be talking about now. First of all, just to mention that the nuclear famine report that Ira referred to in some detail is available on our website, ippnw.org, and the exact address of that has been dropped into the chat for you by our helpful Molly. The next question that came in was, will all this information be available somewhere afterwards? So I want to assure you that a recording of this set of presentations will be available on our website shortly. And also that the content of this will be formed into a briefing paper. So you will have multiple ways to digest and progress through this material kind of in your own time as we all sit with it and figure out what is our role here. Now, I've got a question for Linda from Sally Ndungu, who's our co-president in Kenya. And Sally wants to know, as the nuclear power plants supply 50% of Ukraine's electricity, which is a daunting amount, what's a practical proposal in terms of shutting them down without causing further acute stress to the country's infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question in light of what Ira concluded with when you said if there's no cure, then you must exercise prevention. And the dilemma that Ukraine finds itself in is a direct result from choosing an energy supply that is deeply unreliable at the best of times, and even more so in the circumstances in which Ukraine now finds itself. So there is no obvious quick solution as to what can be done in the midst of a war where it's too dangerous to run the plants, but you're cutting off 50% of the electricity supply if you shut them down. I think that the bigger lesson here is that this is not the way that we must go forward. And that's why I put that slide in, unfortunately, about Ukraine's decision to buy more nuclear power plants, because that's absolutely contrary to the lesson that we should be learning from the war situation, which is that we have to turn to more benign forms of energy that are reliable in all situations, including under the climate crisis, and not just in the instance of conventional war. So whilst they are in a similar situation to, for example, France, which is heavily reliant, 70% reliant on nuclear power, and has had over half the fleet out and has nowhere to turn because the nuclear power monopoly basically squeezed out renewable energy development. These are lessons that we must learn going forward, that there is no cure in this situation. And so we must prevent the construction of further nuclear power plants and turn to safer forms of energy.
Thank you, Linda. And I think you've spoken previously about how, people who say, well, nuclear power is good for the environment, and that really no actual environmentalist really can think that. That's not a viable position. And I think the state of affairs in Ukraine really highlight that. So thank you for your continued advocacy on this. It's so appreciated. Our next question is for Ira. And this is a bit of a speculative thing, but do you think that Biden is considering the risk of nuclear war in a more balanced way than Putin is? How do you think Biden's thinking about this?
I actually do think that President Biden has been paying a great deal of attention to the danger of nuclear escalation. He's stated repeatedly that his policy is to both try to support Ukraine in repelling this Russian invasion, but that his overriding concern is to prevent escalation to World War III, to the use of nuclear weapons. And it's a very difficult balancing act, which he and other countries around the world have been trying to carry out. How do they support Ukraine in its effort to resist this aggression without triggering a wider conflict? But I think that the avoidance of nuclear war has been foremost in the minds of the U.S. administration. There's reason to wonder, to question whether they've done everything right, but I think that's what they've been trying to do.
Thank you. Barry, I wonder if you could think about this for us. I mean, we've heard now about the humanitarian and environmental costs of the ongoing conflict in its current form, and then as well the potential devastating toll if things take a turn for the nuclear. And what do you think that ordinary people can do to help to pull us back from that brink of catastrophe?
Yeah, I think a lot already is being done through a wide variety of organizations, as Ira pointed to, who are working towards not only ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons, but also to try to prevent their use in this situation. I think the main thing that people can do is to include this in their conversations with not only their elected representatives and others who make decisions at the governmental level, but including in everyday conversations to raise awareness throughout the public. Ultimately, the elimination of nuclear weapons will happen when there's the political and the popular will to do so, and that responsibility is incumbent on all of us to advocate for that and to include discussion of this in our daily conversations. So the other thing is that many of us teach students and others in training, and we can really leverage our influence by training other leaders to carry this message.
Ruth, if I could add a brief comment to that. There has been some uptick in understanding of the nuclear danger since the invasion of Ukraine. There's some more attention being paid to this problem. But the level of concern is really totally inadequate given the extraordinary level of danger. And so I think it's really incumbent upon all of us who understand how dangerous the situation is to, as Barry was just suggesting, do everything that we can to spread that message. We have something of a window of opportunity in terms of public receptiveness to this conversation. And we really need to take advantage of it and make sure that we do not find ourselves in this situation again. Every year that passes makes it more difficult to rein in the nuclear arms race. It brings us closer to a nuclear war. And we have to understand how urgent this situation is, which I think none of us do, myself included. In our daily lives, we're still not getting it. And we need to figure out somehow how to elevate the attention paid to this.
Yeah, I quite agree, Ira. We've had a question from one of our other co-presidents, Dr. Arun Mitra, and I thought I might direct this to Linda because I know that you are policy diva, our policy queen. And I guess it's a question about, is it now time to lobby the governments of European countries and persuade them to talk to the Russian government and negotiate peace? What should we be asking of governments in the light of this terrible threat?
Well, I'm not necessarily an expert on the policies of war fighting or not, but I think I share the view of probably most, if not all of us, which is that an effort to negotiate peace does not seem to be on the front lines, as it were, to use a bad metaphor, versus continuing to arm Ukraine, which is seen as a sort of necessity. If there's no off-ramp that won't provoke a nuclear war or the use of nuclear weapons by Putin because he can't be humiliated into defeat, then we have to just defeat him militarily. I don't see the logic of that argument. And actually, I'm much more interested to know what Ira and Barry think about this, because I just get the sense that pushing negotiation and trying to get these guys to the table and sort something out that inevitably will be a compromise that will not please either side, but is better than doing what's happening now. I don't know how you get that done, but it doesn't seem to be a high enough priority versus just letting the arms manufacturers reap in the profits while they ship all their deadly weapons to Ukraine. But I'll defer to my colleagues who know more about this than me.
Certainly, we'll hear from.
Ira, do you want to comment, or?
Go ahead, Barry. I'll follow you.
Well, I think we should encourage. It's a delicate balance here, because I think many of us want to support Ukraine in repelling the Russian invasion, this aggressive war. Some people call it a terrorist attack that's been launched against Ukraine. But at the same time, we want to encourage peace efforts, and hopefully there will be other countries that are able to bring bring Russia and Ukraine to negotiations. Someday this war will end, and hopefully sooner rather than later, and hopefully before so many more other people are killed and injured. Ira?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously every one of us would like to see a rapid end to this conflict. The question is negotiated settlement possible at this time? And it doesn't appear that it is. Both sides have put forward positions which are mutually exclusive. The Russians insist that they will only negotiate if Ukraine accepts the Russian annexation of 4 provinces of Ukraine, which is completely illegal under international law. The Ukrainians say they will not negotiate until they liberated all of their territory, including Crimea. I think it's more than just a question of wanting to support Ukraine as it tries to resist this invasion. There's a lot more that's at stake here. If Russia succeeds in conquering a large piece of Ukraine as a part of this war, having explicitly used its nuclear arsenal as a shield to advance its conventional military forces, Ukraine having given up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s in exchange for a pledge from Russia that it will not ever invade. This is going to do enormous damage to the entire international order. It's going to be a powerful argument in many countries why they should acquire nuclear weapons, and will tend to spur nuclear proliferation. So it's not as simple as just ending this war. I mean, frankly, if I thought that cutting off military aid to Ukraine, which essentially means getting Ukraine to surrender, would end the danger of nuclear war, I would favor that. As horrible as that would be for the people of Ukraine, because nuclear war is even worse. But it's not at all clear that's the case. If we cut off aid to Ukraine, the rest of the world, and end the war on those terms, it may simply lead to an even more disastrous situation in the very near term. And this is an incredibly complicated situation, which I'm personally very glad I am not responsible in any way for resolving.
We'll just jump in and add one more thing, I think, which is is a responsibility for all the leaders of all countries in the world to draw attention to the fact that, number one, this kind of war has a massive carbon footprint. And so it is making the climate crisis, which is already not being managed adequately, far worse. And number two, the thing that all of us as people on this planet should be concentrating on now, priority one is addressing the climate crisis. We can't afford to be fighting over bits of land at this point, because it won't mean anything in the grand scheme of things if we don't save the planet we have and that we live on right now. And so I think I don't know enough about the UN to advocate this, but it seems to me that there's a mechanism there whereby countries around the world, not just the powers of NATO and the ones that are directly involved in this conflict, but everybody who's concerned about our mutual survival because of the climate crisis, should be pressuring these guys to sit down and negotiate, to cease fire, and then try to work something out, because otherwise it's making a crisis that we are already losing the battle with infinitely worse.
Thank you. That's very well said. I have one more question for Ira. Morton has asked, under what kind of scenarios do you foresee the actual use of nuclear weapons?
Well, there are several possibilities in which nuclear weapons could be used. There could be a decision made by the Russian leadership that it is losing the war in conventional terms, and that is an unacceptable result, and that the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield will turn the tide in their favor. And I think that's probably the most direct way that this conflict could escalate to nuclear war. It could also escalate to nuclear war if NATO gets involved more directly in the conflict, either by sending in NATO troops into Ukraine, which would probably be crossing a red line from the Russian point of view, or if NATO is accidentally attacked. If a Russian cruise missile overflies the border, and as has happened once so far, and strikes a significant target in Poland or in Romania, both of which are NATO countries that border on Ukraine, or Hungary or Slovakia for that matter, that could lead to a broader war between Russia and NATO. And under those circumstances, the danger of escalation to nuclear war would be very great. But the most immediate concern, I think, is that the Russian leadership would choose to use a tactical nuclear weapon in the face of conventional defeat on the battlefield in Ukraine. And I think the West needs to be very clear that, number one, it will not retaliate with nuclear weapons. But number two, that if that happens, the groundwork has to, I hope, be being laid for further efforts to totally isolate the Russian leadership, and if they make such a disastrous decision.
Indeed. I have a final question for all three of you, and I feel like I kind of know the answer already, but I want to see how you're going to answer it. We might start with you, Linda, and the question is, would you say that we are in greater peril now than we were a year ago?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a year ago, there was no war in Ukraine. Days away, but not yet. So incontrovertibly, and I think the fact of the moving of the hands of the doomsday clock quite recently to 90, from 100 to 90 seconds to midnight was indicative of a consensus on that. And there are people who feel that they didn't move it actually close enough to midnight, that only 10 seconds wasn't really enough. And that sort of supports, I think, what you were saying, Ira, which is that people, aren't grasping the degree of alarm that we should feel about what's going on there, and the incredible peril that we're all in, and the paramount necessity to do something about it.
And Barry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, my answer is the same, and I harken back to what Ira just said a few minutes ago. That is, given a number of Russian losses on the battlefield, despite the fact that they're pouring in more and more troops and weaponry and so forth, and the fact that there's very little indication that Putin will step back or try to seek some kind of negotiated settlement, I think the risk of a nuclear war, Russia's use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine is increasing. So I'm concerned that things are far worse than they were even at the start of the war.
And Ira?
I have the exact same take as Barry and Linda on this. A year ago, we thought that if there were going to be a war, it would be over very quickly, probably with a Russian military victory. Now, what we see is a situation where the war is dragging on for over a year, with no end in sight, and with a Russian defeat possible. And I think that dramatically increases the chance of this escalating, given the mindset of the Russian leadership. And also, it has dramatically increased the chances, as the war continues, of a disaster at one of the nuclear power reactors. So I think we're in a much more dangerous situation than we were a year ago.
I completely agree. And I think all the reasons that you've all three enumerated help us to understand why discussions like this one are so important. And it is not, the way forward is fraught and it's difficult. There's no clear way out of this, but it gives us clear direction for the future in terms of what we must demand of our governments in terms of the abolition of nuclear weapons. We're getting to the end of our time together, so I wanted to come back to each of you again to see if you have final thoughts, final messages that you really want to leave people with as they go about their day and think about what their contribution might be in trying to make this world of ours a little safer. I might start with you, Ira.
Well, as I said in my remarks before, I think we really need to focus on the elimination of nuclear weapons, which I think we have a greater chance of achieving than is apparent to most people at this point. And we can't wait for the war to end to do that. We need to be doing everything we can now, creating the conditions so that when this war is over, if we are lucky enough to survive it, we have created a real understanding that this is an unacceptably dangerous situation that we have created by allowing these nuclear weapons to exist, and we simply must eliminate them.
Thank you. Barry?
The wide awareness of this war provides an opportunity for all of us to raise awareness, not only in the public health and international humanitarian community about the hazards of war, but to bring to the attention of the whole world the catastrophic effects of war on health and human rights and the environment, and its impact on climate change as well, and that this is an opportunity really to engage many more people and our organizations in the prevention of war and the promotion of peace.
Thank you. And Linda?
Yes, and I think the big challenge is getting the message out. So whilst we have all the messages, the outlets in which we can get our messages read, seen, and heard are very challenging. Somebody actually put, I think, a question in the chat about the media and how much they just lap up sort of the party line a lot of the time. So all of us, I think, have a responsibility to speak more, to write more, to put out more information and try to engage the media, because the machine that we're up against is very well funded and it saturates the media market with their messages, and it's our responsibility to push back against that. So everybody listening here today, all of us speaking here today, have, I think, that responsibility to talk about this and write about this and broadcast about this as much as we can.
I completely agree. And I think that is the way forward for us together. My sister reminded me that when we were both much younger, I gave her an Amnesty International sticker, and she put it on her guitar case, and it said, "Find your voice and use it." And I have had the pleasure for the last hour of spending time with three people who have clear, strong, articulate voices and platforms from which to speak. But we must all find new ways every day to use the voices that we have and to find new ways to share these clear, strong messages, so that we're not alone in understanding the risk and not alone in working through the implications of what a world free of nuclear weapons is really going to require of us. So I'd like to thank all of you for your participation, and thank all of the many, many people who've logged in either on Facebook or on YouTube to watch along, to bring your comments and your questions. I know there will be a few comments and questions we didn't get round to, and I'm sorry about that. But thank you for your vigorous participation in this. And most importantly, I really want to thank our IPPN Review staff, especially Molly, for putting together and being the behind the scenes expertise that keeps the trains running. So thank you very much to everyone. Have a very good night, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.